ששת ימים תעשה מלאכה וביום השביעי יהיה לכם קודש שבת שבתון להשם. Work may be done 6 days, but the seventh day must be holy to you. It is the Shabbat of Shabbat to Borei Olam. In the 1970s, a visiting rabbi once gave a lecture here in Miami on the incredible life of the famed Chafetz Chaim Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen Kagan. He described the great sage who lived a humble life as a shopkeeper in the tiny village of Radin, yet was recognized throughout the Jewish world as a sensational tzaddik and visionary. With the onset of the war, he was forced to move to Vilna, a much larger metropolis, where he witnessed Chilul Shabbat for the very first time and cried uncontrollably. The following week, he couldn't believe his eyes when he witnessed yet another event and cried more profusely. His Talmidim asked Rebbe, "Why are you crying more this week?" "Last week I cried for a Yid being Vaykhel Shabbos Kodesh. This week I'm crying for me. I'm wondering why I feel less bothered this week than last." The rabbi paused as there was another story he wished to share, yet he only knew a portion of it. As he stood at the lectern, he decided he'll tell it anyway, rationalizing to himself that even an unfinished story about the Chafetz Chaim would have a meaningful message. He spoke of an incident with a teenage boy in the Chafetz Chaim's yeshiva who was found smoking a cigarette on Shabbat, the sacred day of rest. The Hanhala were flabbergasted and felt the most appropriate response is expulsion. When the Chafetz Chaim heard the story, he asked that the boy be brought to his home. At this point, the rabbi interrupted his narrative and said, "I don't know what transpired when they were together those few short minutes, but I would give anything to know what he said, for I am told that that boy never desecrated Shabbat again." How wonderful it would be if we could relay that message to others, encouraging their Shemirat Shabbat. At his conclusion, the hall emptied, except for one elderly man who remained in his seat alone with his thoughts. From a distance, it seemed as though he was trembling or perhaps even crying. The rabbi walked over and asked, "Is everything okay, sir?" The man responded, his head towards the floor, still visibly shaking. "Where did you hear that story of the boy and the cigarette?" "I really don't know," answered the rabbi. I heard it a while ago, and I don't even remember who told it to me." The man looked up and said softly, "I was that boy." The two walked together where he shared the balance of the story. This incident occurred in the 1920s, when the Chafetz Chaim was already in his 80s. I was terrified having to go into his house and face him. When I entered his home, I looked around with disbelief at the poverty in which he lived. It was unimaginable to me that a man of his stature would be satisfied to live in such surroundings. Suddenly he appeared, and he was remarkably short. At that time I was a teenager, and he only came up to my shoulders. He took my hand and he clasped it tenderly in both of his. He then brought my hand up to his face, and when I looked into his soft and saintly face, his eyes were closed. Then he opened his eyes, and they were filled with tears. He said to me in a hushed voice, full of pain and astonishment, "Shabbos!" He began to cry. He was still holding my hand, and while he cried, he repeated, "Shabbos! The Heilige Shabbos!" Over and over he repeated this refrain, and my heart, it started pounding. I became more frightened than I had ever been before. Tears streamed down his face. One of them rolled onto my hand. I thought it would bore a hole right through my skin. When I think of that tear today, I still feel its heat. I can't describe how awful I felt knowing I had made the great tzaddik weep. Yet in his rebuke, which consisted only of those few words, I felt that he wasn't angry. He was rather sad and fearful, perhaps frightened at the consequences of my actions. The elderly man then caressed the hand that bore the invisible scar of a precious tear. It had become his permanent reminder to observe the holy Shabbos for the rest of his life. The Chafetz Chaim in his Hakdama to Chelik Gimal of the Mishnah Berurah says, "It's lo yimale." It's impossible not to be Mechalel Shabbat weekly if one doesn't regularly study the laws of Shabbat and review them regularly. There are simply so many, and the details are so eccentric. The Eglei Tal, the Sachachover Rebbe, shares a remarkable insight as well, and he says, just like Shemirat Shabbat has the weight corresponding to all other mitzvot combined, so too the learning and teaching of Hilchot Shabbat has the weight of teaching all of the mitzvot combined. Chatam Sofer shares that proper Shemirat Shabbat brings an extra beracha and hashpa'ah on an individual as well. Toldot Adam writes that Shemirat Shabbat kihilchata brings a person to a level of da'at, sechel, and midot ushlemot that he otherwise naturally wouldn't have been able to attain. Yet, since Shabbat is lamala min hateva, the reward is as well. Of course, there are innumerable derachim to honor the holy Shabbat. Rav Shach, he would prepare his Rebbetzins Nerot for the following Shabbat on Motzei Shabbat. Allow me to close with this transfixing episode, and perhaps we or myself, I can glean a single inspiration. At one point, the holy Ritbaz, Rabbi Yaakov David Velansky, was very ill, lying on his deathbed. He was surrounded by many Talmidim. Suddenly, he stirs from his bed, his eyes alight with an unearthly fervor. What unfolds next is nothing short of mesmerizing. He began, when I arrived upstairs, I was immediately drawn to the heavenly scale, loading my mitzvot and avonot. I was petrified as the scale appeared too heavy on the wrong side. The Perush I wrote on the Yerushalmi was loaded on the scale, movement in my favor. Not monumentally sufficient, however. I was both aghast and paralyzed. Then appeared a magnificent malach testifying that I would set our Shabbat table every Thursday night in anticipation of Shabbat Kodesh. Immediately, they returned my soul to my body below. Even the smallest acts performed with intention and devotion resonate in the highest realms. May we as Am Yisrael imbue our lives with similar reverence and capture every sacred glowing moment. Amen. And Shabbat Shalom u'mevorach.